Hello, my treasures. It's time for the second round of balancing changes for Festival of Legends and a huge system update for the Death Knight class. So let's begin with the Death Knight change. Cards that require 3 runes will no longer be discoverable or generated off of random effects. This impacts Death Knights so much. So while I did feel like this was probably going to be the change that Blizzard was going to do, I was kind of hoping that they would have made it where that discover pools were actually affected by the runes that you chose when making the deck. However, while thinking about it, it probably wouldn't have actually done anything in the long run. This change does affect all the existing Death Knight decks, as both Blood and Frost are going to be heavily hit by both of these. Unholy, ironically enough, might be the best Death Knight deck now, because it has a lot of tools that don't require you to run 3 Unholy runes that will be easily discoverable and are more powerful than their 3 Unholy rune cards. Also, looking at the dev comment, it looks like Blizzard does agree with me that it is a little bit frustrating to play against a deck that can't normally run a particular card but can randomly generate it. I do think in the future, once we do see a bigger Death Knight pool and it is in a similar position to where all the other classes are right now, that triple rune cards will probably be re-added to the Discover pools, but because of how small the pools are when it comes to Death Knight as a class and how strong some of those cards are currently, this does help bring down the power level by quite a bit. So now that we're through that, let's look at the nerfs. The first one is going to be to Rowdy Fan, which is going to have a change from giving +4 attack to +3 attack while it is alive. This is mainly because of Lady Cynthia, which honestly makes a lot of sense. Those two cards in combination with each other could be incredibly powerful, but this card was also really good at giving a bunch of aggro decks a really good buff and a really hard buff to remove from whatever minion, which means a card like this did need to see some type of balancing change. The next change is to a Death Knight card, which is Overseer. Their attack is going to be lowered to 3 instead of 5. I don't really think this affects too much and probably won't affect the playability of this card in any way. But let's get to the standard buffs, most of which I actually predicted. First one is going to be to Rockmaster Avun, who is going to be a 3 mana card instead of a 4 mana card. This should increase his playability by quite a bit, as it allows you to play it more easily on curve and allow you to easily use this in an aggro based deck where you just want to get a lot of additional advantage by having a lot of menagerie type minions within your opening hand or whenever you do slam this card down. It was actually kind of weird to me that it already cost 4. I know you in theory could get a lot of advantage off a card like this, but in most cases you're probably only going to get 2 additional copies of a card, and there's much better cards that do something very similar that exists in other classes. So now for the next one, which is going to be Verse Rift, which is going to cost 1 mana instead of 2. This is probably the change that makes the most sense when it comes to a card like this. However, I do not think this will probably increase the playability of Rift Warrior. It still has no big payoff, which is a huge shock for packages like this that only show up in one individual set, as most of these packages have always had some type of big legendary to go in combination with them, and in this set, for some weird reason, all the rifts did not have that card. I'm only going to assume that the mini set will probably have some type of a big payoff of rifts. However, honestly speaking, if I had to really change all of the rifts, I would have made them scale off of each individual rift that you play throughout the game. Something very similar to the Abyss Curses within Warlock, and then you could have some type of menagerie rift deck that could be a lot of fun to actually play. Warrior really needs some really good support, and I don't think these rift changes are going to change much. Speaking of another rift change, Bridge Rift is also going to be lowered by 1 mana, though again, I don't know how much this increases the playability because the deck still has the exact same issue. No big payoff, no win strategy, and this is not going to change that fact. Now, the next card is going to be Power Slider, who is going to have 1 increase attack and 1 increase HP. This actually puts it in line with a lot of the other 3-drop cards that do currently exist in Standard. And honestly speaking, this will probably increase the playability of this card by quite a bit, and it does give some type of payoff to Menagerie Warrior. Even though you do also have One-Amalgam ban, I think this one is just going to be a little bit more consistent and does cost a lot less, thus allowing you to use it way easier in a aggro-based deck. Now for the next card, which is Shield Block. Shield Block is going to cost 2 mana instead of 3. This change doesn't shock me at all, though the nice thing about this change is heavy plate and it no longer share a mana cost, which means you in theory could run both in the same deck if you really felt like it. However, because we no longer have Shield Shatter, there is no real big reason to want to gain a bunch of armor outside of surviving, which means you're probably not going to want to run both in the same deck, but I do think this does increase the playability of Shield Block by quite a bit, and might actually just fit in any single warrior deck that you make currently in Hearthstone. Doesn't matter if it's control or if it is a aggro based deck, just a draw card on 2 mana that gives you some type of advantage, aka the armor is actually pretty decent. Now for the next change, which is going to be to Frighten Flunky, he is going to have an increase of 1 HP. I don't think this increases the playability of this card in any bit. Honestly, I think the one thing that hurts this card in particular is it has no type of tribal tag. Because it has no type of tribal tag, you don't really have a reason to want to run this in a Menagerie deck, and there are a lot of really good, powerful Menagerie taunts that currently exist in Warrior. Honestly, I don't think this is the type of buff that Warrior needed to see to make a taunt Warrior deck fully functional. Now, for one of the biggest changes, Tobalor is going to now revive infinitely. I don't understand why this wasn't in from the beginning. I know he could have been incredibly annoying to actually deal with if he does revive infinitely. However, a lot of the fire spells in Warrior seem to be balanced around the fact that he would revive infinitely, and because of that, the deck never really took off. The deck still doesn't have a real big payoff, which is the main hurdle that deck is going to be facing, and there isn't really too much synergy outside of the individual waves of support of fire that we actually did get for Warriors, since we did get it through across quite a few individual sets. It's weird that this is one of those packages that has actually been supported in quite a few sets. However, it doesn't seem to have a central identity, and I think that is what's hurting it the most, to be honest. Now, for the mage changes, the first one is going to be to infantize the magnitude, which is going to lower the cost of the spell discovered by 1. That actually is a change that I did not expect them to make. Mana Cheat is always incredibly powerful, and because we also are going to be seeing a change to one of the big payoffs for Naga Mage, a card like this giving Mana Cheat is really scary. I don't know any way to actually put it besides that. This card in theory could go off quite a few times in the exact same turn. The only thing stopping that from really happening, unless you discover more additional copies of it, is the fact that it returns to your hand at the end of the turn, but this is still going to make it a lot more playable than it currently is. Alright, now for the next one, which is Audio Splinter, which is going to be a 2 mana, 3 attack, 2 HP minion instead of a 3 mana minion with 4 attack and 3 HP. This should increase the playability of this card by quite a bit, because it does allow you to play on curve, which is always really nice to see, especially in combination with a light show, as this will allow you to easily get an additional copy that wasn't originally in your deck, and you can just keep going infinite, and maybe this will actually make a light show Mage a really popular deck. So let's get to the next card, which is to Spite a Lash Siren, lowering the cost to 4 to put it back in line where it was before they made the original nerf to it. I think this is a really bad change that they're making. This card was already borderline playable, and we already know from past history that Naga Mage, when it was 4 mana before, it was incredibly playable, and we have a lot better support for it now than we did back then. We also have Mistake card that allows you to have another 1 cost Naga that's allowing you to always get 1 mana back. There's just so many ways that this card has improved over the past year it's actually existed, that Blizzard changing it back to a 4 mana card is going to be a huge mistake that will probably be reverted in a few weeks or maybe a month. On that note, let's go to the next card, which is going to be Arcane Artificer. They're going to increase the HP by 1. Makes a lot of sense, puts it in line with a lot of the other 1-drop cards that have a very similar positive effect nowadays, and it didn't really make sense why they brought it back with only 2 HP. Now for the Hunter changes, the first one is going to be Stranglethorn Heart, which is going to be 8 mana instead of 10. While I do love the card and I love the animation behind it, I don't know how much this actually increases the playability of it, mainly because Hunter doesn't really have too many survivability tools. We no longer have Mountain Bear to have a way to protect our own face using a card like this. If we had something like Mountain Bear currently in standard rotation, this card would be a lot more playable. But as either way, I am actually quite glad that it went with 8 mana instead of 9, because if they left it at 9, I don't think it would affect it at all. But at 8, it has a little bit of a chance to actually be playable. Next change is going to be to Paladin Brightwing, whose battle cry is going to affect arcane spells in both your hand and deck now. This change, I don't understand why it wasn't the original intention of the card. It's very similar to Torvalorn, where both of these cards should have just read this when they were originally printed. And honestly speaking, you could have printed on this card for the rest of the game your arcane spells have +1 spell damage, and it would have been perfectly fine. So you could actually use a bunch of discoverability tools. But as it currently stands, the amount of arcane spells that currently exist in Standard Hearthstone, I don't know if that will push the deck far enough to actually see any bit of play. The problem mainly with that deck is the fact that its big payoff is a card that generates a bunch of tokens, or you would much prefer that deck to have some type of big payoff in a big damaging spell. Now for the next card, which is going to be Jazz Base, increasing the attack of this by 1. I do think Blizzard realized a lot of the weapons that they printed within this set don't actually see a much competitive play, and because of that, they're trying to buff them up in a way where they don't become absolutely broken, and the best way to do something like that is by increasing their attack. But the nice thing about giving these weapons +3 attack is the fact that they can easily be used as removal tools. Now for the next card, which is going to be Alter Cord, which is going to increase the damage of it to 6 instead of 5. Honestly, I don't think this change does much to the card at all. I would have lowered the overall cost of the card whenever you were overloaded to maybe 1, just to be a little bit safe. And now for the next card, which is going to be Flow Rider, going to be lowered to a 1 mana card. At first glance, I would say, hey, Overload Shaman has a turn 1 play. Problem with that is you need to be overloaded for the battle cry to actually work on this card, which is the one problem with this card. However, because historically speaking, overload decks do keep yourself at a very low mana, lowering this to a 1 mana card does increase the playability by quite a bit. It allows you to easily combo it on a turn where you may have 1 or 2 mana, and thus draw you into an additional card such as Overdraft that unlocks you all of your mana crystals. It would be cool if this said discover a copy of a spell in your deck, but that may or may not be a little bit too broken even for modern Hearthstone standards. Now for the next card, which is Lightning Storm, Overload is going to be 1 instead of 2. This makes a lot of sense. There's not much else to say about this card. The fact that it still had to overload all these years later from the original set made it really, really hard to actually want to include in the deck. Now for the Warlock cards, first one is going to be to Crescendo, which is going to be lowered to 2 mana. A lot of these AoEs, it makes a lot of sense to lower the mana or change something about them to make them a lot more playable, and this is just a really good example of one of those cards. As it currently stands, because we don't have any Fel Warlock support in Standard Hearthstone, a card like this is going to be still quite playable in a Fatigue Warlock deck, but there isn't too much hope for a card like this to be absolutely broken, so I do think it is quite a bit safe by putting it down to 2 instead of 3. Praise Conductor is going to be lowered to 4 mana instead of 5. I would have hoped that they would have lowered this to maybe a 3 mana card, but lowered the stat lines even further from what it is currently, but that might have been absolutely broken depending on how or what decks this would have fit in. I think a Fatigue Imp Warlock deck I know is floating around currently, and I think both of these changes will probably make that deck a little bit better, where you can actually play that deck without worrying too much. Siphon Soul is going to be reduced to 4 mana instead of 5. Makes a lot of sense. It's in line with a lot of the other removal that we see at 4 mana nowadays, and it was just a really outdated card from Classic Hearthstone. For Rogue, we are going to be seeing an increase on their weapon to 3 instead of 2. Again, puts it in line with the Shaman weapon that we saw earlier, and does allow you to use it as a removal tool much easier than you could before. I don't know how much this increases the playability, and there really isn't a way to increase the playability as mentioned before with any of these weapons, outside of just making them scale quicker, which honestly would have been a huge mistake, and I'm glad that they went with this path instead. Now for the next one, which is going to be emceeing Tron, which is going to be a 5/5 instead of a 3/4. I am so glad that they went with this change instead of lowering his mana. By lowering his mana, he would be insanely powerful, and this just allows him to have a little bit of a better stat line. I don't think this will make his playability outside of the decks that currently use him any more playable, but this is really honestly just a very safe change, and I'm actually kind of happy that they went with this change instead. Holy Nova is going to be lowered to 3 mana instead of 4. This, again, is one of those cards that was just really outdated for what it actually did. Should make Control Priest a lot more playable than it currently is, because it did lack a very good AoE board clear for early game. The closest that you could get to was Cleanse the Scene, and that didn't really do much if you weren't surviving till turn 5. Okay, now for the Druid cards. First one is going to be Chosen of Elune, reducing their mana cost to 3 instead of 4. Don't know if this increases the playability of this card at all, because I don't know if you really want a third copy of Solar and Lunar Eclipse, to be honest. There's really not too many big payoffs to have a third copy of this, especially given the fact that Moonlit Guidance currently doesn't exist in Standard Hearthstone. I would have honestly changed this to 2 mana, and it would have been incredibly playable, but given the fact that you can't get to 20 mana anymore, I don't think even having it at 2 mana would have changed much. Next change is going to be Deathbloom Whopper, which is going to be lowered to a 5 mana card and changed to a 6/5. Wasn't this card originally a 7 mana card, and it's been changed now twice? This is honestly probably where the card should have been when it was originally released, making it a real easy card to combo out with some of the other Death Rattle support that we do currently have in Standard Hearthstone. Alright, so those were all the balancing changes to Standard Hearthstone. Let me know down below what decks you're looking most forward to actually using. And like always, if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, comment, subscribe. Until next time, bye bye.